Hello, and welcome to the Early American Brass Band podcast. My name is Chris Troiano. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen Cannistraci,
Hello, everybody.
and we're super excited to be starting this podcast today for you guys. The premise that we have, that we kind of formulated for this podcast, is to open up and be able to talk about a wide variety of things in relations to early American brass bands in the 19th century. We kind of hope to get to a variety of topics, such as just talking about generalized bands that occurred during the 19th century, but also bands that exist today in the 21st century as reenactment bands. We want to talk about composers, instruments of the time period, specific instrument makers of the time period, and we hope to eventually bring in some guests to talk about either the research that they've conducted on 19th century American brass bands, or even the bands that they're conducting and leading today as reenactment bands. Something else that we're kind of hoping to do at some point is bring on different recordings of different bands that currently exist. That kind of goes along with bringing in guest artists for their bands, but we hope to listen to some current bands and talk about them, maybe review some CDs, but we really want to make this a combination of 19th century brass bands and the 21st century reenactment brass bands.
Yeah, I think it's a very strong tradition in other parts of the world, the brass band tradition. You see, in the UK there are brass bands everywhere, but in the United States it was more of a short-lived phenomenon. So it's going to be cool to kind of bring this background and talk about it as it's progressed over time in this country. So I'm really excited for this.
So one of the reasons why Stephen and I wanted to start this podcast is because we've been seeing a rise in interest in both the scholarly research surrounding Civil War brass bands during the 19th century, but also uh, an interesting culture that's kind of happening in reenactment brass bands. We know that following the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, brass bands kind of started declining. There was a big build up to the creation of these ensembles in the early 2010s, and then shortly after, a lot of the bands started folding or not being as active. But despite that, there are still a lot of very active bands, both with performing and education. So we find it super interesting that these bands still exist and still are trying to perform on a regular basis, but more importantly, educate both audiences and students of music. So a little bit about myself. So like I said, my name is Chris Troiano. I am a euphonium slash baritone horn player. I've been playing my instrument for a little bit over 20 years now. And I actually got interested in Civil War brass bands back when I was growing up on Long Island. My father's actually a tuba player, and he would play regularly in the Old Bethpage Village Restoration Brass Band under the direction of Dr. Kirby Jolly. That brass band went on to perform two selections for Ken Burns's Civil War documentary. And, I just kind of went to the Old Bethpage Village a ton growing up and just got to really absorb this kind of music. And then I went off to college, went off to Texas, came to Virginia. Time passed, that experience kind of recessed in the back of my memory for a little bit. And then it was coming to Virginia where I was all of a sudden surrounded by this Civil War history and music that I got really interested in it again. So I actually started a Civil War brass band affiliated with George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And we were able to acquire through the university uniforms and instruments to be able to create this ensemble. So it's been a real joy, getting to jump back into this area of research and lovely, exciting type of music. And Stephen Cannistraci is actually one of our euphonium baritone horn players in that ensemble as well. Stephen, you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. It's been a blast playing in that group that Chris founded. And it's funny, getting to know Chris and working with Chris a lot. It's funny how kind of loosely similar our backgrounds are. I grew up in Pennsylvania, um, and in Pennsylvania, as I'm sure many other states, there's a really strong community band tradition. And I was lucky enough, my elementary band director conducts a band in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, which is where I'm from. It's currently the name is the Perseverance Band. But in kind of getting back into this research, with Chris, I learned that that band actually mustered up during the Civil War, and they were attached to the 93rd Pennsylvania Regiment. So that kind of piqued my interest a little bit, and I've always been interested in kind of Civil War era history. Growing up in Pennsylvania, pretty close to Gettysburg, and then I went up to Rochester for school, back down to Pennsylvania for school, and then now I'm back in school in Virginia as well. And much like Chris, being surrounded by all this Civil War history. The city of Fairfax, there's a lot of history there. And then right down the road is the Bull Run battlefield. And it's really kind of reignited that interest. And then so when Chris started the brass band at Mason, that really kind of was another catalyst. So I'm really glad we're able to do this. And it's been great to kind of dive back into some old curiosities I had. And then that led to this. So
Yeah,
we're
that's really
excited.
cool. That's really cool about your hometown band. I didn't know that you had discovered that information. I was in on Long Island. I was in a number of community bands there as well, but I'm not sure if they actually started during the Civil War. How did you come across that information, like piece those bits together to find out that the band that you had been playing in was was a Civil War band?
In Well, I've played with them in the summer. I mean, it's just kind of summer season stuff,
Mhm.
and it was kind of mentioned, and I forgot about it. The director, each concert kind of given a history of the band, is kind of mentioned, and then there's a woman in the band who is kind of the official historian, and I emailed the band director the other day um, about that history, the Civil War history, and he connected me with this woman in the band who's been doing a lot of research, and they, I think they mustered up, yeah, and they were attached to the 93rd Pennsylvania Regiment band, and that's actually documented. There's a website that's like specifically for Pennsylvania Civil War uh,
Mhm.
regiments and whatnot,
Yeah.
and they actually have the roster of people, the names of the people who were in the band when it was attached to that regiment. So,
That's awesome.
um, yeah, it was just kind of mentioned, in a couple concerts, and I'd forgotten about it. And then, kind of getting back into this research, I remembered, and I've done some digging, and it
Mhm.
it checks out. So,
So that's really cool. I'm not actually really familiar with the 93rd. Do you know, like off the top of your head, any like engagements or what kind of action they might have seen during the war?
yeah, so it looks like they were organized in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, 1861, September and October.
Hmm.
Um, and it looks like their first kind of duties were in defenses of Washington
Yeah.
um, till about 1862. It says they were involved in the Battle of Manassas,
Hmm.
um, Battle of Williamsburg, Battle of Fair Oaks.
Hmm.
Um, looks like they pushed into Richmond as well. Um, they covered Pope's retreat to Fairfax Courthouse, August, late August into September. So it actually looks
Yeah.
like they were in this area a
Yeah.
fair amount.
I was gonna say. So not only did you make the connection that the band that you played with back home was a Civil War band, but you discovered that they were literally marching up and down the streets that you travel almost every day.
Yeah, this is wild. I mean, looking at these places, it's like Alexandria, Fairfax Courthouse, Harper's Ferry, Antietam, Stafford, down to Stafford, and down into Fredericksburg. That's all in 1862. And then 1863, yeah, it looks like they were down in the Fredericksburg area. Saw some action at Gettysburg. Um,
Yeah, so they were all over the place.
oh yeah,
Does it say when they were mustered out by any chance?
this it goes to 1865, mustered out on June 27th, 1865.
Okay, so they made it to the end. So they basically were there the whole war.
Yeah, wow,
Yeah.
that's wild. I mean, I had looked at this page briefly, but I didn't look into it that much.
Awesome. So before we actually get into the meat of today's topic, which is actually just going to be an overall of band activity during the time of the Civil War, it's kind of acting as an introduction episode for those of you that might not be incredibly familiar with brass bands during this time period. We want to let you know that we do have a website, and uh, the notes for each episode are going to be available on the website. The website is eabbpodcast.com. That's eabbpodcast.com. I think, yeah, Steven, what's the overall plan that we're going to have over there?
So for the website, it'll kind of be a landing spot for everything related to the podcast. We'll have the episodes up there that you can play right on the website. We'll also be on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify. Hopefully, we can get all the technology figured out there. But my kind of main idea for the website was to have show notes for every episode that kind of give a recap of what we talked about, and then some resources that we either mention, or if you're interested to dive further into the topics we talked about in the episode, there will be some links for you there and resources you can dive into, to satisfy some of your curiosity that I hope these podcasts spark for you.
Yeah, awesome. So let's dive into it a little bit here. The Civil War broke out in 1861, but brass bands didn't just crawl out of the primordial ooze in 1861 as well. There was definitely a lead up and an evolution of music up to the point in 1861, dating all the way back to revolutionary times, colonial times. During the Revolutionary War, the military units would employ field musicians, much like they did during the Civil War, and it would consist of usually a fifer and a drummer. And they would utilize these two instruments, the fife and rope tension field drum. They would use these instruments because they were loud and very shrill. They were able to be heard over great distances and over loud troop noise. So they would utilize these instruments on the field for helping maneuver the troops during battle and in the camp as well, to be able to be played over the entire large area of the camp. In addition to the field musicians, they would also have what was known as bands of music. These were more like recreational types of music ensembles that were roughly kind of like woodwind quintets, but slightly larger. They would utilize flutes, clarinets, oboes, then natural horn, so basically a French horn, but acting as like a bugle with no valves. The valve hadn't been invented yet, and they would use these types of ensembles to perform concerts for the troops, and even in towns in between engagements as well. So those were bands of music. Similar thing kind of happened through the War of 1812. Obviously, after the Revolutionary War, the United States was very anti-standing military, so the military numbers came down. The United States kind of went into a reserve format where each town would kind of have reserve troops, and attached to those reserve troops would usually be a form of music as well, both field musicians and bands of music. War of 1812, Army, grows again, and then following the War of 1812, those numbers came back down, and we saw the reserves kind of come back, the guard units in each town. So as the recreational music with the bands of music was becoming more and more popular as peacetime lasted a longer amount of time, those reserve units kind of became more of a social fraternity and more of a social time. So the recreational music became a little bit more important to those people than the field music did at the time. You transition after the War of 1812, as this becomes more popular, brass instruments are becoming more popular as well. Steven, you want to talk a little bit about the development kind of the brass instruments and how that got us to where we are in 1861?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, you had natural horns and natural trumpets, which did not have any valves. So in order to change the key that they played in, they would have to pop out sections of tubing, call them crooks, and put different crooks in to be able to play in different keys. So once the valve technology came along, that really made these instruments a lot more agile, a lot more easy to play, and they were fully chromatic without having to really change anything out. So this valve technology was really important, and to a large extent, the same technology they were using back there is what we're using today. I mean, we still see trumpets with rotary valves, trumpets with piston valves. Same thing with tubas. So this valve technology, was very important, and it's interesting. The valved instruments were, not around for very long before people started writing really hard music. So and we're running into some of that stuff, with the music we play in the band. It's some of those E flat trumpet parts or cornet parts are extremely difficult. So as far as the brass bands go, the first brass bands, they utilized keyed bugles and ophicleides, which an ophicleide is it kind of looks like a brass bassoon, but with a mouthpiece instead of a reed. It's very weird, weird looking instruments. And so with the advent of all these instruments that are easier to play, more agile, town brass bands became extremely popular throughout the United States, kind of in areas that were industrialized, where there were a lot of people, a lot of workers, and to a large extent, immigrants from the UK really had a large influence on the instrumentation of these ensembles because they were coming from a place that already had this brass band tradition. In Europe, kind of each mine or each factory would have a band that was associated with it, and the owners of these mines and factories encouraged all their employees to play in these brass bands because in their minds it would keep them out of trouble. So then when you bring those people over to the United States, they bring that tradition with them. So that's why you see a lot of these early brass bands in places like New York and Boston that were already kind of industrialized and had this tradition. And so the first kind of publication that I could find of a lot of this brass band music was from 1853. It was the Firth, Pond and Company in New York. And they began publishing the Brass Band Journal, which was a collection of saxhorn band pieces. And to kind of talk about the music a little bit, all these pieces were kind of popular music forms. You'd have marches and quick steps and other forms of dances. And that lines up with kind of the purpose of these brass bands as entertainment music in the time. They were kind of playing the popular music of the day. I had a college professor one time who said that these brass bands were kind of like the iPods of the mid to late 1800s. So that's kind of where this is coming from. But in addition to some of those popular music forms, there was some more substantial, pretty difficult music being composed for these bands. The Manchester, New Hampshire Cornet Band, their books have a lot of really difficult music in them. So you kind of have both sides of the coin being represented there as far as the music goes.
I remember reading in one of my books about the famous band leader Patrick Gilmore. He was a famous band leader. He was also a cornetist, and they wrote about how he was always practicing and wanted to practice so much that when he would go to sleep, in order to continue helping to improve his embouchure while he was sleeping, he would take a mouthpiece and tie some string around the mouthpiece and then tie the string around his head so that the mouthpiece sat on his lips while he was sleeping. Now, I
Man,
don't
I
know.
gotta try that.
Yeah, right. It'll help with our scales for sure, trying to
Yeah,
get all the way up to 3 octaves. But
right.
yeah, I don't know how true of a story that is, unless he was like a really still sleeper. But
Who knows?
yeah, that just shows, at least anecdotally, the commitment that these musicians had at a very early on stage in these instruments development of trying to develop their technique and musicality and all that kind of stuff. I thought it was kind of crazy.
Yeah, really, because once that valve technology came in, it
The sky was the limit.
yeah, yeah. I mean, really, there was nothing that a little bit of practice wasn't gonna enable you to do on the horn.
And that was a big component of the rise in popularity of the brass bands because, like Stephen was saying, you had the key bugle, which was invented actually all the way back in 1810, and then shortly after the ophicleide, which, like Stephen was saying, is kind of like a bassoon, but it actually translates to keyed serpent. Is actually what ophicleide translates to. The what is it? Office means serpent, and kleis means covered, so it's like a covered serpent.
Hmm.
Um, these instruments, although producing similar timbres, tone qualities that we're used to hearing with modern day brass instruments, the key mechanisms were had a pretty steep learning curve. It went from 5 keys to 7 keys to 9 keys. The intricacy of these instruments kept on getting more and more complex as time went on. So definitely that learning curve was getting steeper and steeper until, like you mentioned, the invention of these valves in the 1830s really allowed for the everyday man to be able to pick up these instruments, which again ties into what you were saying, like with the brass bands in the UK, right? The everyday working man being able to pick up an instrument easily.
Yeah, and they prided themselves that there were no professional musicians in those bands in the UK. And it's funny, doing a little bit of reading on the Library of Congress website, um, that in the United States in the early brass bands you kind of had amateurs and professional musicians mixing, and so like the culture of being really proud that everybody was an amateur player wasn't quite there in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Is that still the case over in the UK? I know that they still have a really active brass band tradition, a very competitive brass band tradition.
Yeah, I can't speak for sure, but I think that that amateur tradition is still what they try and uphold. I think there's kind of like a threshold now where you can't make like a certain amount of your income uh, from playing.
Gotcha.
So yeah, you would still have to have like kind of a non-playing job to keep that more amateur status.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Cool. So you were saying that the introduction of the valve allowed it to become a little bit more accessible. So do you know uh, when this transition kind of started happening? Like when, well, first when bands moved from kind of the mixed bands of music version where it was woodwind quintets with some brass instruments, then started incorporating the brass instruments, and then eventually becoming all brass. Do you know when that kind of started happening?
I'm not sure when that started happening, but in doing some reading, it's kind of interesting because there was a time, like you were saying, with the bands of music, which is primarily woodwinds, and then eventually, we shifted, and there were a lot of just plain brass bands, and then there was kind of a shift, like a merging of the two, which is how we kind of get like the modern military band instrumentation, and that was really influenced by some German and Italian immigrants and band leaders who came over to the United States who um, kind of started to add back in the woodwinds, and that was happening even before the Civil War. A little bit, and I think after the Civil War was when we kind of got that transition back to a mix of the brass and woodwinds. But I'm not sure when the initial shift, like from woodwind centric ensembles to brass centric ensembles, happened.
Yeah. Well, I know the famous Spanish band leader in the United States in New York City, Claudio Grafula. He
Mm-hmm.
had his Seventh Regiment New York band and was often regarded as being one of the best bands in the country. And they were exactly what you said. They were uh, a mix of woodwind and brass instruments as well. I know the United States Marine Band maintained its woodwind section throughout the 19th century, even as it was adding in brass instruments, and never went fully brass like a lot of these other town bands and militia bands were.
Right.
And then I was also doing some research, and I saw that this, as the brass instruments were being created, introduced, uh, after 1810 with the keyed bugle and the 1830s with the sax horns, the all brass bands kind of started forming where it was just brass instruments by themselves. The earliest one I saw was 1834, was the Dodworth Brass Band in New York City,
Hmm.
and then followed by the Salem Brass Band and the Boston Brass Band, both in Massachusetts
Right.
in 1835. So it was those two bands, or three, I guess, 1834 and 1835 was when brass bands became pure brass bands. And then, yeah, as you were saying, that transition was kind of happening slowly over time as these instruments were becoming more common, more affordable with the Industrial Revolution and with tooling that made these instruments easier to manufacture. And yeah, it led to the beginning of the American brass band movement in 1835.
Yeah. So from the mid 1830s to the beginning of the Civil War, these brass bands were kind of attached to town centers and were, uh, gaining popularity. I read that these brass band concerts were sometimes being paid for by the railroad companies, so that they had an opportunity to raise the fares for people coming into town to see the
Hmm.
concerts. So these brass bands were super popular. Because of the type of music they played and just how many of them were around. So then the Civil War broke out, and this kind of changed a lot of things, not only in the country at large, but kind of in this brass band tradition. And I was reading that um, some people attribute the rapid response of the North to muster up this huge army very quickly to some of these brass bands, because the brass bands were very, very popular. And it seemed like there was a trend um, for these brass bands to kind of enlist as a group in the Union Army, which then people would see that their favorite brass band had enlisted in the Union Army, so then they would be more likely um, to enlist themselves. So there were some of these bands that enlisted and then were attached to a unit of soldiers, a regiment. So Patrick Gilmore's band was formed in 1858. And they were eventually attached to the 24th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Unit. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but the modern day Perseverance Band in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, my hometown, they enlisted and they were attached to the 93rd Pennsylvania Regiment. So that was one way that these regimental bands were formed. And then another way um, was had to do with the War Department General Order Number 48, which was issued in July of 1861, and that gave two field musicians, so your fifers and your drummers, two field musicians and up to 24 bandsmen per regiment. So the field musicians are different than the bandsmen. So then, as you kind of build the army here, you would have these two field musicians in every regiment. And then when you get up to through the brigade, the division, up to the corps level, that's when these field musicians that were assigned to each regiment, where you build these numbers of field musicians as you go up in these divisions of the army. Once you get up to the corps level, which is about 3 to 4 divisions, which is roughly 26,000 soldiers, that's where you see those field musicians, the fifers and the drummers. They can come together then and be kind of a fife and drum corps, which we have some still active in the United States today.
Yeah, I know
Um,
there's a big tradition of fife and drum corps down in Colonial Williamsburg area. We obviously have the full time old guard fife and drum corps over here in Arlington, Virginia. We have those guys. We have at George Mason University, there's a fife and drum corps. So it's really interesting that at the band level, that all of these reenactment brass bands are kind of representing bands at the regiment or sometimes the brigade level. But then when we have these fife and drum corps, those larger ensembles are meant to represent the larger makeup of a military unit at the corps level.
right. Yeah, because you would start out the American Battlefield Trust has a really good graphic on their website that kind of details um, the divisions of the army. So I touched on this a little bit, but maybe just lay it out in a little more clear terms. You'd start with the regiment, which would be about 800 soldiers, and then you would get 2 to 5 regiments together, which would form a brigade, and then 2 to 4 brigades makes up a division, and then 2 to 3 divisions make up a corps, and then the larger army is three, corps of soldiers. So you get up to like 80,000 soldiers in an army made up of smaller corps.
Yeah, awesome. And then this idea of having a regimental brass band, it being a brass band is a novel idea, but the idea of having more of a recreational, morale boosting musical unit is not a novel idea, which we touched on earlier. The bands of music, those woodwind with a little bit of brass elements that existed in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So these types of recreational ensembles did exist prior to the Civil War, but the Civil War was the first time that it was utilized as primarily brass bands, but also on the large of a scale. The fact that there was a War Department order issuing each regiment having the ability to enlist up to 24 bandsmen per regiment. It's really interesting. And fun fact, a 24 person band could be enlisted per regiment for infantry regiments and artillery regiments, but cavalry regiments could only have up to 16 bandsmen. I don't know if that has to do with the the cost of the horses, maybe made that band number lower. I'm not necessarily.
Probably. I wouldn't want to play a brass instrument while riding a horse, that's running at full speed.
Yeah, so there's actually one brass band that currently exists that does still reenact cavalry brass band units. So the second Cavalry Brigade Band in Central Ohio actually still portrays this tradition of cavalry brass bands, and they have a lot of really good videos online and on their Facebook page. That's actually really a sight to see. It's really awesome seeing both, a very high performing brass band in addition to them being on these beautiful gigantic horses. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. Great input, Stephen.
So once the Civil War broke out and these regimental brass bands were involved in the day-to-day activities of America in wartime, they kind of had a variety of roles. One of the more important roles that a regimental brass band would have would be entertaining the troops at night. These troops, it was the first war where troops were being transported by train, but the majority of troop movement was still by foot, was still on the move. So these musicians would march for miles in 100% wool uniforms with all their gear in the middle of, most of the time Virginia heat. It was pretty miserable, and they would do this for days and then start shooting at each other. So not the most uplifting life experience to be having at the time. So these brass bands would be with the soldiers all the time, and at night would serenade them with concerts, both of patriotic airs to kind of keep them motivated, but then also playing ballads and serenades and arias that would remind them of home. Some tunes that I kind of think of off the top of my head is like Just Before the Battle Mother or Lorena or Home Sweet Home. These types of beautiful ballads would, remind the troops, of their loved ones back home and give them a revived sense of what they're fighting for. And it was incredibly powerful, and the troops loved their brass bands. They would advocate for them if there was ever a threat of them being cut or relocated. The troops loved them. There's a lot of instances of officers either increasing the pay of the band or raising money to buy them new instruments, or just raising money to keep them with their regiment. Officers would, dish out money out of their own pocket just to keep these bands there. So it was super important to have bands in the camp for morale purposes. Other functions that these brass bands would serve would be as they were marching, the brass bands would perform tunes to keep the troops entertained while they were moving. I mentioned earlier that one of the innovations of brass instruments was the over the shoulder sax horn. So, over the shoulder sax horns, although being labeled as sax horns, are not indeed sax horns. Sax horns is a term given to brass instruments developed by Adolf Sax. He's a Belgian instrument maker. Um, he created the sax horn in the 1840s, but the over-the-shoulder sax horn was actually invented in 1838 by Alan Dodworth in New York City. So the idea of these over-the-shoulder sax horns being called sax horns is just incorrect nomenclature, but it's just the popular name that kind of took off. So these over-the-shoulder sax horns would point backwards behind the musicians and allow for bands to play to troops marching behind them so that the troops could hear them. It's basically the first bell front, like marching band like instrument, except they pointed backwards.
And if you heard the name Adolf Sax and are thinking of another instrument in the reed family, the saxophone, yes, it is the same gentleman. He also invented the saxophone. Fun fact.
Very fun fact.
I wonder if these bandsmen, since they were in the front of the band, like, did they like have maps on their drums so they knew where they were going? Was that another duty that they had to know where to go?
I'm sure that's exactly what it was.
Yeah, probably.
It was the drummer's job to lead the army, across the country. I'm not sure I would trust any of my drummer friends to do that.
No. Oh, certainly not. No.
You give it to the euphonium players; they'd be able to get you where you're going.
Yeah, we're a very particular bunch. We know what's up.
So actually, transitioning that into one of the other roles that they would do. So yeah, they would march with the troops to keep them entertained, but being at the front of the invading force most of the time with the northern armies, they would be the welcome wagon essentially for the brass bands into these sometimes hostile towns. It was very common for these brass bands to play songs of the rival army when they were entering new towns, just to try to warm up the townsfolk to their presence. So it was kind of like a what's the word I'm looking for? Not negotiation. Olive branch.
Yeah, an olive branch, peace offering.
Yeah, it was kind of like a peace offering. Yeah. So I thought that was super interesting also.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that they would try and soften the townspeople.
Yeah, so then I'm not exactly sure how this would happen. I know that they would soften the townspeople. The band, the army, sometimes would ransack the place, but the army would do whatever it was doing there and then pass through the town. Most of the time the band would play for a majority of the time that the army was in the town, and they would be the last to leave also. So I don't know if once the army passed through the town, if the band then had to like double time it back to the front of the column or what that was like, but that would make the band job even more exhausting if they had to wear the uniform, play their instrument all the time, and then when they were done, run all the way to the front.
Right.
What do they call that? A ladder exercise in track and field?
Oh, yeah.
Or a ladder relay or something like that.
And if all that wasn't difficult enough, then in the battles, they had other duties too. I mean, you have the field musicians playing during the battle sometimes, but the bandsmen would oftentimes serve in a medical capacity, either pulling people off the battlefield or assisting in the medical tent, tending to wounds. So these bandsmen were really kind of all over the place all the time in the war. I kind of get the general sense that they did a lot more than people think, than just playing.
Yeah, the regimental brass bands were purely non-combatant. They never picked up arms and fought during a battle. There are instances of field musicians actually doing this, like drummers dropping their drum and then picking up a rifle and fighting. There was actually a few Congressional Medal of Honors awarded to field musicians for doing this. But it didn't happen with regimental brass bands. The idea was that the least effective combatants would be issued to medical purposes. So, being musicians, not super capable in the field, so they were assigned to assist with cutting people's legs off, and it was a pretty grim and grisly experience, I'm sure, during battles for these people.
Yeah, they never took up arms, but they probably picked up a few arms.
Good one, Stephen. And there's a few instances also of bands playing during fighting. There's at least one account of a personal account of a soldier kind of rounding a corner and then running into a band playing a patriotic air during the fighting and like under fire and all this stuff. So it was, at least in certain circumstances, the case for brass bands to play while the fighting was going on, again, as a form of morale boosting for the troops. Similarly, there's a few instances of band battles going on back and forth of either brass bands from rivaling armies playing at each other before the battle starts or the night before the battle when they're camped across the river from one another, playing at each other. So that was something that happened during the time period as well. One more account that I read, there was a Union army that had a brass band and the Confederate army did not. And they were camped out across a river from each other the night before they were about to start shooting each other. And the Northern brass band was serenading its troops. And then the Confederates were shouting across the river, requesting tunes for the Northern band to play for them, which they did. So the Northern band provided entertainment for both armies that night. Which is kind of wild to think about, that they would go through that type of experience and then go on shooting each other. It's kind of like the Christmas piece? What is that one?
Oh yeah, the Christmas Eve in, what was that, World War II?
Might have been World War One. I think it was trench warfare. They came out of
Yeah,
the trenches and like sang Christmas carols and went back to shooting each other the next day.
there's an opera that somebody wrote about that, and actually Kaylee and I saw it at the Kennedy Center a year ago.
All right.
Uh,
About that instance.
yeah, and it was really cool because it was written in, because you had the United States Army, the German Army, and I think the French, and so those characters in the opera, like the English Army would sing in English, the German Army characters would sing in German, and the French Army characters would sing in French. So you had all these languages going on. I just like punched the microphone stand. It's called Silent Night. Kevin Putz is the composer. It was an opera in 2 acts.
Is it new?
Yes, it was premiered in 2011. So
Okay.
not brand new, but
No.
fairly new.
Well, not, yeah, 18th century opera. So,
Right.
well, obviously not 18th century if it's talking about World War One. But
Yeah. Yeah, 1914. So that would be World War One. Yeah.
nice, very interesting. So these were a lot of the roles that bands would take on during the Civil War, and brass bands were utilized throughout the entirety of the Civil War from 1861 to 1865 in that capacity. There's not a lot of research on brass bands in the South. We know they existed, and there were a number of really good ones, but the documentation for brass bands in the North is much greater, and we know that a lot of it could have come down to cost. There could have been significantly less in the South just because of the war and the economic status of the South at the time, maybe not able to afford brass instruments as readily as the North. But we do know that music was an important aspect of their soldier life. Also, they utilized a lot of folk instruments, a lot of string instruments, and that would serve similar functions, string bands, as we were just mentioning, to the brass bands. This whole time we've been talking about regimental brass bands, but actually on July 29th, 1862, the War Department issued General Orders number 91, And this order actually abolished all regimental brass bands because they were finding that they could save millions of dollars by not having the government support thousands of brass band musicians. So this order abolished regimental brass bands and allocated that duty to brigade bands. So the music and their function all stayed the same. It's just uh, the number of brass bands slightly decreased. I mentioned slightly because there's a number of instances where, again, like I mentioned before, officers or men in the regiment would pay to keep the regimental brass band with their regiment, and then they would kind of hire them as like contracted work that way. Um, but then there's also instances of the soldiers that were in the regimental brass band being remustered into an infantry status with that regiment, and then as an infantryman, they would then just be allowed to continue playing their instrument. So they wouldn't appear on muster rolls as a bandsman; they would appear as an infantryman, but it would still their role would still be as a brass musician. Granted, when the format moved over to the brigade band style, the bands generally got a little bit better because uh, getting promoted to that type of a level, they prioritized the really proficient musicians. Um, but yeah, so the duties and everything remain the same for the brigade bands as they did for the regiment bands. So that's why you'll sometimes see today with different reenacting brass bands. Some of them refer themselves as regimental brass bands. Some of them refer themselves as brigade bands. And that's where that distinction kind of comes from.
Yeah, I guess because the regiment was the smallest and probably well, they were the smallest collection of soldiers, so they were the most plentiful division of the army. So I could see how that would be a very obvious money saving measure to kind of do away with a lot of those. Well, not do away with, but to reassign a lot of those musicians.
To restructure it for sure.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting book that was published in 1966 called Bands and Drummer Boys of the Civil War. This was written by Arthur Wise and Francis Lord. Uh, in that book, they talk a great deal about the different roles, the different duties of all the brass bands, both in the North and in the South. They actually mention that in January of 1862, that the Union Army had at least 618 bands, which equated to at least 14,000 bandsmen. So that was 14,000 brass players that are separate from the field musicians. And that's just in the North. So, yeah, definitely able to cut down on cost by trying to wean those numbers down just a little bit.
So as these musicians were either getting out of the army or as the Civil War kind of came to a close, um, they would return to where they came from. We mentioned Patrick Gilmore a little earlier and how his band, the Gilmore Band, was attached to the 24th Massachusetts Volunteer, and so they were mustered out in 1862. So kind of towards the beginning of the war, but then they returned to Boston and they grew and they promoted Gilmore's Grand Boston Band. Um, so
Yeah, exactly. The Patrick Gilmore, had the brass band, and then as it transitioned into his Grand Boston Band, he was promoting that and made band music incredibly more popular in the United States. But he began incorporating uh, woodwind instruments similar to what the Marine Band was already doing and what Claudio Grafula was already doing. But he was such a showman, and I kind of think of him as like the Penn and Teller of band music. He was just incredibly showy, incredibly popular, and he had two hosted two national peace jubilees to commemorate the end of the Civil War. One he had in the summer of 1869, In my notes, I have the summer of '69. I think I was making a joke myself there, like what is not John Fogerty? Is it? Yeah, that
Who is
classic
that?
rock song.
Yeah, yeah, I know the song.
Yeah. But that event was 5 days long and involved 30,000 singers, a 1,000 piece orchestra, and six bands. So this event was absolutely massive and was incredibly well attended. He tried to outdo himself the second time in the summer of 1872. He extended the celebration to 18 days, but the event was not nearly as well attended, so he stopped after the second one. But both of those events were uh, very grand in scale, very showy, and really helped solidify Patrick Gilmore as a celebrity in his time.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, we see, through doing this research, how popular these brass bands were before and after the Civil War, and it's kind of interesting to think about that, how it relates to kind of the shift that then happened, kind of in the 20th century, where orchestras kind of became more popular and more prevalent in the United States, which they already were in Europe, but these these bands before orchestras really came about and were well funded, these bands are what people were going to see, and they were playing the music that people wanted to hear. Um, and we still get a little bit of that, but I think, current day in the United States, I think the orchestra is kind of predominantly the large group of choice.
I think
Um,
some of that goes back to what we were saying earlier about how brass bands, bands in general, are populated by the everyday person, sometimes at the amateur level, but it's just incredibly accessible to listen to and to be involved in. I think maybe to a certain extent that makes it feel lowlier, maybe a little less sophisticated.
Possibly, yeah.
But then we know that the band tradition transitioned more into Dixieland and jazz. So if you're tracing popular music, it's more like the orchestral tradition goes into the band tradition, goes into jazz, goes into rock, blues, all that kind of stuff. Um, but it is interesting how today, even though bands helped create that popular music that we listen to today, orchestras still exist, but are like almost held to this much higher standard and higher uh, podium of exaltation from the public. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. I might be biased, but there's still nothing like, like a summer outdoor band concert.
Oh yeah,
It's
and we're super fortunate to be living in the DC area and having all these awesome bands right here.
yeah.
So Patrick Gilmore was this huge celebrity and was loved by everybody right up until his um, kind of unexpected death in 1892. He unfortunately died shortly after a performance, and his band and the whole country was absolutely shocked. But around this time period, there was another band leader that was kind of up and coming, and he was starting to make a name for himself as a band leader, as a composer, and he saw himself as uh, needing to challenge Gilmore to try to obtain this uh, pinnacle band leader spot. And this person was John Philip Sousa. So John Philip Sousa was kind of biting at the heels of Patrick Gilmore. Definitely reputable in his own right at the time, but he really wanted that spotlight. And then with Gilmore's death, that would left the lane wide open for Sousa to kind of take over. And as they say, the rest is history. We all know John Philip Sousa's imprint on Americana and the band world.
So around the time that John Philip Sousa was really becoming a well-known household name is when we start to see um, the recording technology develop. And really, kind of the first way that things were recorded were on wax cylinders. And these kind of go back to the 1890s, that popular tunes from the Civil War were recorded on these wax cylinders. There's a recording of the Battle of Manassas that was played by the Edison Symphony Orchestra on a wax cylinder, and that dates to 1899. But what's interesting about these early recordings is that they were predominantly vocal quartets and voice and guitar and smaller ensembles. And I think that has a lot to do with the mechanics of recording on these wax cylinders. And there's actually a really interesting YouTube video that we'll put in the show notes that shows the process of recording something on a wax cylinder. And when you think of wax cylinders, you think of the phonograph that, you load the cylinder in the phonograph and a needle comes down onto the cylinder and it's got that big, cartoon horn that comes around, and that's how the sound gets out. And when you were recording on these wax cylinders, it was kind of that process in reverse. You have that big horn, but that's what you would be singing into. So this recording technology, this early recording technology, kind of limited the size of the group that you could record with any sense of fidelity in the recording. And then that transition, these cylinders were kind of brittle and they were really easy to break, and you couldn't reliably copy them many times. So then as the recording technology developed, they took the cylinder and flattened it, and now we have these discs, these wax discs that people recorded on, and you could record more music on them, and you could also pick up more players. So there are early recordings of bands on wax cylinders and wax discs, and they sound like early recordings of bands, because you really just you have that one horn, the recording horn in the front of the room, and all the sound is getting funneled through that horn. So that's why on these recordings you hear a lot of the upper voices, you hear a lot of the woodwinds and whatever was kind of in the front of the band. And there's a library of some of these early wax cylinder and wax discs recordings that's run by UC Santa Barbara, and we'll have the link to that in the show notes as well if you want to poke around and listen to some of these early wax cylinder recordings. So then as you move forward with this recording technology, you get the LP that we all know and some of us still collect. And the first recording of Civil War era brass band music on an LP with a more modern sound was done by Frederick Fennell. And so before this, that recording was released in 1960, and before 1960 you see the tradition of these really large concert bands. So you have, because they were the idea was to mimic the size of an orchestra, so you had a great big clarinet section, you had a lot of brass, the trumpet section would go all the way up to E flat cornet, all the way down to flugelhorn, and you had this big instrumentation. And when Frederick Fennell did this recording, leading up to being released in the 1960s, once that recording hit the market, that's kind of where we see a shift back towards interest in the Civil War brass band instrumentation that we've been talking about up until this point. And it kind of led to a resurgence of those bands kind of coming back. And the first Brigade band formed in these reenactment bands was formed after that recording was released. They were formed in 1964, and it's often kind of cited as being the first Civil War reenactment brass band.
Yeah, so we just went all the way from the Revolutionary War up to 1964. So that was a lot of time that we just covered, and we are treating it as an overview, of this type of music and of these bands. We're familiar that many of you listening might already be experts or well versed in this type of music. We just wanted this to be, an introductory episode so that everybody's on the same page going forward. We are very excited to mention that our following episode, the next episode, is actually going to be kind of a deep dive into the record that we were just talking about, Frederick Fennell's Eastman recording of Civil War brass band music. We've done some really fun research there that we're excited to share with you in the next episode. And going forward, yeah, we'll be doing more deep dives into specific topics, bringing in different guest artists, talking about different recordings on more specific levels. And we're just really excited and thankful for you guys for joining us today.
Definitely, this is the first podcast that either of us are doing, so we're really excited to kind of jump in to this medium. And if you want to get in touch with us, we do have an email address that you can send an email to. It's eabb.podcast@gmail.com. That's eabb.podcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear what you thought of the episode, and if there's any piece of information that you know of that you'd like to share with us, we'd be all ears.
So at the end of each episode, we're going to highlight a featured album of music that we want to expose you guys all to. This first episode, we thought it would be appropriate to feature Ken Burns' original Civil War soundtrack. Ken Burns was actually inspired by Frederick Fennell's Eastman recording that we were just talking about, and inspired him to kind of go through old photographs that he had and begin his journey on creating that Civil War documentary that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. It's often cited that it's Frederick Fennell's 1960 album started the interest in brass music, and if you didn't get inspired by that, then you most likely got inspired by Ken Burns' Civil War documentary itself. So we're going to put some information and link that album on our website. That is eabbpodcast.com. We hope you go over there and check out our featured highlight of Ken Burns' Civil War original soundtrack.
Yeah, so thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us for this kind of introductory episode, and we'll talk to you in the next one.
Thank you.